We're excited to welcome Professor Duchin, who's a professor of mathematics at Tufts University. Moon received a BA degree in mathematics and women's studies, which I love, at Tufts University, and received her PhD in mathematics here at the University of Chicago, where she also taught in the gender and sexuality major with Professor Elaine Hadley. She was also part of a coalition for a safe campus at U Chicago, which worked on issues such as getting gender-neutral bathrooms on campus. Moon has been a Guggenheim Fellow and a Radcliffe Institute Fellow and was elected to the American Mathematical Society in 2017. Her work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Sloan Foundation, the Arthur Foundation, and the American Association of University Women. She received a Professor of the Year award from the Math Society at Tufts and received a major graduate student teaching prize while she was at the University of Chicago. At Tufts, Moon was one of the founders of the Science and Technology Studies program and runs the interdisciplinary metric geometry and gerrymandering group Redistricting Lab, which is based in the Tisch College of Civil Life. The group researches data science interventions for civil rights, and she'll be speaking to us about that work today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Moon Duchin.
Thank you. All right, I am so excited to be here today. When I was a grad student here, it was very meaningful to me. So right next door is where the math people hide out, or is it that way? Yeah. Getting to really participate in the life of both the math department and the Gender Studies Center while I was here really enriched my time intellectually and socially. And so this is an important place for me, and it's really a pleasure to be back. One of the things that I was just remembering with Red is that there was a working papers workshop in the Gender Studies Center when I was here, and I got to have some of my papers kind of read by folks from all different fields. And one of them was exactly on how a topologist like me might think about classification as we classify people. And I actually think this work is in many ways an outgrowth of that. So I want to think about representation, I want to think about elections, I want to think about what we call social choice in math, and generally kind of take the attitude and the question, what does it mean to represent? Democracy has something to do with majority rules, but what space does that leave for various kinds of minority people, minority interests, minority points of view? So that's the question that I want to take, and I'll spend a fair amount of the time actually talking about one of the technical bureaucratic pieces of the story, which is the Census Bureau, and how we think about who even lives here and gets to vote and gets represented. Okay, so all that to say, let's get started. All right, so I have spent since about 2016, when I got handed a voting theory class at Tufts to teach, and in teaching it was like, wow, this is hard and deep, and there are a lot of open questions, Since then, I've been really, with the blessings of tenure, able to turn attention to thinking about gerrymandering in particular as a math problem. So let me just set up the question. The question is, so here's an actual plan that was made by the North Carolina legislature in 2012 and enacted into law. And the question is, what's wrong with this plan? And you might look at it and immediately have some intuitions about what's wrong with this plan, and perhaps it's that it is ugly. That is your first intuition that says something might be wrong. But so what? Ugly how and ugly why, and you know, what can we do about that? Well, maybe those ugly shapes are a means to the end of targeting African Americans with almost surgical precision. That's a quote from the court decision that invalidated this plan, the district court decision. Okay, so maybe the ugly shapes have something to do with race, but ultimately, maybe also they have something to do with party. And so another point of view on what's wrong with this plan is that it reliably converted what has been a very stable 50-50 Republican-Democratic voting preference to a 10-3 Republican delegation. Okay, so that's 50-50 voting going to, well over 70% of the representation in a reliable way, and I'm going to probe that and get us to think about what I mean by reliable here. So maybe the question is, do these facts interact? Is one of them prima facie evidence of abuse? Where is democracy being subverted, and what can we do to fix it? These are the questions. This is the puzzle that I got interested in. Okay, so zooming out from that, let's think for a second about what representative democracy looks like to a mathematician. You've got people. They come together in a political organization or a polity. They vote on things, and there's an outcome, right? But from a math point of view, there's kind of an algorithm, there's a system that makes this happen. So we actually have to design a ballot. We have to decide, first we have to decide who gets to vote. Then we have to decide what they're asked. Then we collect their votes. But then there are some tallying and aggregation rules that turn it into an outcome. And all of this is called the system. And so as a mathematician, a very obvious place to intervene is thinking about the properties of the system, the algorithm that you choose to do this, and the questions that you ask. Ultimately, of course, we can vote on policy issues directly, but direct democracy is fairly unwieldy, and so frequently, as in this country and most countries, what we do instead is we vote on people to vote on things. So we're going to use systems to pick people, and those people will vote on things. And I'm very interested in the question, what are the desirable properties of the conversion of preferences to representation? Okay, well, there's this really classic book from the 60s, which is it's the PhD thesis of Hannah Pitkin, called The Concept of Representation. And at that point in her career, she's a language philosopher. And so she looks at the question, what is representation? It looks pretty different to her. She wants to ask, when we say represent, what do we mean? Do we take that analogy literally? Do we think about the legislature as a portrait of the people, a reflection, an image? All these metaphors get invoked all the time. But she wants to know, what do we actually mean by saying that we want the legislature to in some way look like us? Should they just be representative like a representative sample would be? After all, we can do government by the random. This has been done, and it's being proposed again today. Or do we want government by, in some sense, experts, governing experts, people who, by being semi-professional, can spend more time understanding the arcana and the details, and therefore make better decisions than kind of the untutored masses might make directly. This is one model. Another question, and this has become such an important trope in thinking about representation that I actually have trouble tracing it back to its origin, but I think this book might be it. The question of whether we want representation to be descriptive or symbolic. And what Pitkin means by that in part is, do we want people who look like us or people who have our interests in some sense at the center of their thinking, right? So that's not a question you can solve. These are just questions to pose and think about as we go about like kind of elucidating the norms and the properties of these various systems. For her, it's also very important to ask how our representatives are held accountable. So to be a democracy, we want it to be possible to remove people from office as well as to elect them to office. And that should have something to do with how good of a job they do representing, right? And just whom do they represent? That's actually a really interesting question. So I'll raise here a topic that'll come back later in the talk, which is the question of virtual representation. Do the people that we elect, are they tasked to represent just the people who voted for them? All the people who voted? All the people who live in the area that they're supposed to represent, whether or not they voted, whether or not they're eligible to vote? That's also an unsolvable live question about the quality of representation and what it means to represent well. Okay, so we have the systems algorithmic question, and now we have kind of the language philosopher question, and then we have the civil rights point of view. And so this is the wonderful, inimitable Lani Guinier, who wrote this fantastic book, The Tyranny of the Majority. The book itself comes, I think, from the 90s, but she'd been working on these themes through the 80s and 90s. Here's the very opening quote in the book. She says, "I've always wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. This lifelong ambition is based on a deep-seated commitment to democratic fair play, to playing by the rules as long as the rules are fair. To me, fair play means that the rules encourage everyone to play. They should reward those who win, but they must be acceptable to those who lose." Right? So she's raising now the notion of legitimacy. Right? The central theme of my academic writing is that not all rules lead to elemental fair play. Some even commonplace rules work against it. And in particular, she's going to go on to say, and this is what inspires the title of the book, that we want majority rules because we want democracy. That might be the essence of democracy. But a fixed and permanent majority has no checks on its power, and therefore, per Pitkin would be unaccountable, right? And would sort of break the mechanisms that we use to make a functioning democracy. Okay, so what I'm going to try, this is the long preamble. What I'm going to try to do is blend these points of view. The math, the political philosophy, the civil rights point of view. And try to bring them together and hopefully get somewhere towards the bottom of that question, what is wrong with this district? What is wrong with this North Carolina, right? Okay, so let's dive in. So as I said, the very first thing you have to do is decide what constitutes the polity. Who constitutes the polity? Who are the people? We the people is who the people. Okay, so I'm gonna riff on this fantastic book, Seeing Like a State, in which James Scott talks about how governments make legible the citizenry so that they can regulate. And so here from the introduction are some quotes. So he says, the more I looked at the attempt to make a society legible, to arrange the population in ways that simplify the classic state functions of taxation, conscription, and prevention of rebellion, he starts to realize various things. What emerges for him is that governments try to approximate a detailed map of the terrain and the people. And they do that in order to sort of perform all these classic state functions. Here, map is in scare quotes because it's not meant literally, but I'm going to try to take it literally and look at what it would mean to sort of tabulate the people of this country so precisely that you can map them, and so precisely that you can then manipulate the maps, right? That's going to be the question. Okay, so what does the US Census look like and what is its structure? So these tables I took from Melissa Noble's book, Shades of Citizenship, which some of you may know. It's a great book. Compares US censuses to Brazilian censuses and the way they construct race. But here she shows us what the US Census racial categories were from early censuses and throughout the decades. And what's really interesting if you stare at this list, and I'll encourage you to do that at your leisure, is you kind of see a map of emerging and disappearing ideas about the lumping and splitting that's relevant to government bureaucracy, right? So Indians not taxed appear fairly early, and slaves appear and disappear, of course, at a certain point in American history. If you look at the way white and black people are sorted and categorized, you see a proliferation of categories. Did you know that not only white and black, but mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon were census categories at a certain point? And so census takers were instructed to go and query people and sort them into these bins. And then you see something interesting happen in around 1930, where that gets reconsolidated. And those like partial, oh, by the way, you should interrupt me at any point and ask questions, or, because I have many things I want to tell you about, but I'm happy to do sidelines to topics that are of interest. So what happens here in around 1930 is we have instructions from the Census Bureau at the time, where the census takers were instructed officially, everyone who used to be categorized multiracially will now be black. So it's the bureaucratic one-drop rule, right, that says that any mixed white and black ancestry gets counted as black. I testified about this in court recently when I was on the stand for 2 hours in Alabama on the definition of black. What is black in Alabama? So these are in some sense academic questions, but as we'll talk about when I start to talk about the more practical side of civil rights enforcement in the country today, they're also like deeply practical questions that have to do with who's going to represent, say, for example, the state of Alabama today. Okay, so where does this live? Well, it's kind of interesting when we think about how complicated race and racial self-identification is in the US today. It's kind of interesting that there's a particular statistical directive that defines race for US government purposes. Okay, so it comes out of, interestingly enough, the Office of Management and Budget, right? So back to James Scott thinking about why we do what we do and we classify people the way we do. And it sort of sets out some definitions of major racial categories and how they're going to be used in record keeping and reporting. Okay, but how does this look when it comes to you on your census? So this is the 2020 census race question and ethnicity. So the census does ethnicity separately from race. Ethnicity is a yes/no question, are you Hispanic? And then you sort of delineate what kind of Hispanic origin that you might have. And then the race question is asked over here. It asks you if you're white, black, American Indian. These are different Asian groups, and then there's something called some other race. Okay. There's always a kind of leftover category. That's how taxonomies tend to work. And since the 90s, it's possible to check as many of these as you want. Okay. Interestingly enough, that change to the policy of how race information was collected was actually protested by some of the civil rights groups who you might have expected to support more ways of multiracial identification. But if you think about why, it's partly that for all the reasons that there might be strength in having higher numbers, the proliferation of categories leads to some reduction of numbers in ways that are going to become important when it comes to enforcement of civil rights. Okay, so you're asked all these questions with all this kind of nuance and a place that you can fill in your own answers. But in the end, this is how it comes out to the redistricting data. Okay, so this is a table, P2, a table I know well, in the official redistricting data release that comes out once every 10 years. I should pause and say, we have censuses for many reasons, and I'm going to go over some of what we use this kind of information for. But Article 1 of the US Constitution is what calls for a census to be conducted decennially, and it calls for it for the purposes of redistricting and apportionment. Right, so that's, in some sense, that's why the biggest and most granular redistricting data release is called the redistricting data. Right? Okay. Okay, so what does it do? This is, for example, I think this is the state of Alabama. Does it say somewhere? I think it's Alabama. Yep, there it is. And you can see the number of people in each of these categories, but this is just the beginning. There's more, and there's more, and there's more. Okay, so how much more? Well, remember, there were 6 race categories. You could check or not check the boxes. 2 to the 6th is 64, but you can't leave them all blank, so that makes 63 races, times 2 for Hispanic and not. So there are 126 race ethnicity combos in today's census. And by the way, this is about to get more complicated, most likely, because the census is considering adding a Middle Eastern North African category, which you notice was not present before, among other changes being considered. All to say, if you have really amazing vision, you can see that the numbers actually get very small into the single digits, and there's even some zeros. Because some of the, how many people identified as white and black and Asian and Native American, but not some other race, that's you get all these different combinations. Okay, so what can you do with that? You can make that literal map that I was talking about. So this is what's called a racial dot density map, where a dot is a person, and they're categorized by the major categories that the census releases in that data release. And you can probably start to recognize, New Jersey has this very distinctive shape. So you can see we're looking at the Atlantic seaboard. There's Cape Cod over there. And I'll zoom in on close to where I live. So this is the greater Boston area. And we start to see, so again, green is African American. So you start to see Roxbury and Dorchester, if you know the Boston area. Up north, you see Lawrence and Lowell, and you start to see these kind of enclaves, these distinctive enclaves. Zoom in a little more on Boston, and you start to see, yes, the Boston metro area is very multiracial, but it's still fairly segregated, right? And so this is the kind of granular, when I say granular, I really mean look at these grains, right? This is the kind of specificity with which you can kind of slice and dice the population once you have the census data. Okay, why? Why do we do this? Well, the census counts overall have many uses. I already said apportionment and redistricting is the original kind of constitutional purpose. Why do we need to count? Because even though the Senate has 2 members per state, the House has a number of representatives per state that depends on the state's population, right? So the way that's put in the Constitution is that the representation shall be given out according to their respective numbers, and that's why we need counts. But funding formulas also depend on census counts. So in particular, a recent census study found that $675 billion in funds to 132 programs, and here's a sample, used census data to decide how money was going to be distributed. So there are real material consequences to counts and undercounts. So that's why we count. That's some of why we count. We count to represent, we count to fund, to allocate resources. But why have race and ethnicity in there? Well, there are many reasons. Some of them, of course, enabling audits that lead to better outcomes, potentially. We can audit the differences across race and ethnicity categories. We can look at, for instance, in the first place, whether the census had a differential undercount. It did. We can look at whether unemployment rates differ by race and ethnicity. They do. Voter turnout, lending programs, and so on, right? So there are very important reasons to have this kind of data if you want to think about fairness across these categories, right? They also enable many kinds of social science measurement. So the census is this huge, expensively produced data set that gets used all across different disciplines in social science. And here I have a figure from one of my papers looking at segregation indices in, do you recognize it? This is Chicago, right? There's O'Hare, the poof up to the, right? And so on this side, it must be a little hard to see, I'm sorry. Yeah. So what I'm showing here is Latino and Black population in Chicago. And these pictures are what's called choropleths that show you all the census tracts. So the census has all these different geographic units in a hierarchy. And tracts have typically about 8,000 people in them. And here I've shaded the tracts on a color scale by the percent of people living there that are Black or that are Latino. And then over here we have some plots. I think I blow them up on the next slide, where you can see, if you look at a tract and you look at its percentage Latino or Black, and then you look at the average of the neighboring tracts and you look at their percentage Latino or Black, you can scatter plot those against each other and look for patterns. What would extreme segregation look like? Extreme segregation would look like whatever is true in your tract of the racial and ethnic makeup would also be true in the neighboring tracts, right? And then you'd have just this really skinny zone of transition from darkly shaded to not darkly shaded. And in particular, what that would mean is that you'd see a lot of points clustered down near 0, 0 or 100, 100. Is that making sense? Okay. And low, that's what you see when it comes to Black population in Chicago, right? And so in spatial statistics, there's an important statistic dating to the 1930s, which says just fit a line and look at its slope. And that's going to be a measure of segregation. And actually, there's some fun linear algebra in this. This turns out just to be a Rayleigh quotient for any spatial weight matrix, the adjacency matrix or something like Laplacian, your favorite spatial weight matrix, against the sort of share of population in every geographical unit. Okay, the point being that once you've collected the data, you can math it, right? And you can do things to it, and you can compute with it, and you can use the data in good ways and in problematic ways and in all the ways. And then what I'd like to do is think about what you could do if you didn't have this kind of data. And so I'll just ease into that by saying, well, the stakes vary for the people who are being categorized and enumerated in these ways. So this is an example that's probably familiar to many in this room. So I'm a joint citizen, I'm a dual citizen of the US and France. And in France, just the way the government does race is just 100% different from here. It is against the law for the government to ask you your race in France. Did you know that? So the kinds of statistics we've been talking about just cannot be collected. And of course, that's a legacy of the Holocaust. So this is a carte d'identité from the Holocaust, from the Third Reich period. And you see it stamped Juif across the top, right? And this is part of what enabled some of the notorious roundups in Paris. Because the administrative records were available, it was possible to target the Jews for roundup and deportation, which happened notoriously twice. Interestingly, there was some sort of civil disobedience. Actually, some government officials, understanding these risks, tried to sabotage the census in France at the time. But the lasting legacy has been one of proscription. We're just not even allowed to ask these questions, right? And I should say before I go on, what that means is that officially, we cannot ask the question, is there differential unemployment in France by race? There is, right? But it's impossible to do the auditing because of this like ideology of non-classification, which I think is really interesting.
Okay, so
Yeah.
this is not permitted for the government.
That's right.
But do private organizations are permitted to ask this?
They are permitted to, and they do. But of course, what that produces is like alternative counts, right? And that's also a problem, as we'll see increasingly in the US, as the census data gets destabilized. The question is, where else do we go to get good, reliable data that could be relied on, say, by a court? And it gets much more difficult when it's not officially collected. But yes, absolutely, you can and do collect this data non-governmentally. In the US, there are, of course, legacies when it comes to redlining and more. Redlining, as you all probably know, refers to the practice of sort of outlining on a map neighborhoods and areas that would have different lending policies, different borrowing policies from others. And those were often very explicitly racially delimited. This is a different kind of redlining from an important court case from the 1950s. So in 1954, Brown v. Board of Ed in the US mandated integration, sped along the civil rights movement. In 1957, the city of Tuskegee, Alabama, redrew itself. So actually, it was the Alabama legislature that changed the boundaries of the city. And how did that go? So the city used to be this box, and then it became this figure that you see inside. So it strictly shrank. Why? So it had been an 80% black city and became 100% white. And so this was possible because street by street there was such perfect residential segregation that it was possible to literally draw all the black people out of the city, which is what the city did. So this went up, so this is actually in some sense the first redistricting case to go up to the Supreme Court. This goes up to the court, which decides it in 1960 in a case that becomes Gamillion v. Lightfoot. They decided unanimously. So the circuit court had said this is fine, but the Supreme Court unanimously says you can't do this is vote denial. The reasoning here is that by drawing all the black people out of the city, you've denied them a vote for city leadership, you've denied them access to city services, and so on. So this, per the Civil War amendments, you cannot deny the vote on the basis of race, right? So this one is fairly easy. But as we'll see, the kinds of riddles that I was looking at before are much harder because when you get drawn out of one North Carolina district, you get drawn into another, right? And so the question of the weight, or the power, or the value of your vote is a little bit subtler than whether you have one at all. Okay, let's look elsewhere for another example of enumeration and representation. So this is an example I find really fascinating. This is B.R. Ambedkar, if you recognize him. And he is considered the first so-called untouchable, that is low-caste Hindu, to get a PhD. And here he is writing about the census in late British colonial India, just in the transition period out of colonial rule. So he's writing in 36. And he has this fantastic piece called From Millions to Fractions that asks the question, how many untouchables are there? How many untouchables are there? Okay, well, what does this mean? So to figure out how this was kind of put on the ground by census takers once again, he goes and he digs through records to figure out how untouchable was defined, because there's no, it's not an official, it's not stamped on your identity card, right? So how is this to be operationalized? And the answer is fascinating. So this is what the census superintendents instructed people to do. It's a 10-part definition of what it is to be untouchable. That include, it looks like a list straight out of Borges, right? It includes things like not worshiping the great gods, having no Brahmin priests, causing pollution, not revering the cow. It's this kind of mishmash list of qualities that collectively defines something like an operational definition of untouchable. So what's the consequence? When for the first time a definition is set down, so that people can be counted. That enables a table like this for the first time in Indian history, where by province you have the total population, the population of untouchables, aka depressed classes. And then there's the number of seats in the legislature and seats for the depressed classes. And what you can see is that while untouchables make up something like, what is that, a fourth or a fifth of the population, that's well under 1% of the seats. Right? So this is the kind of arithmetic of representation that only becomes possible when you make certain categories visible and accessible to enumeration. And then, of course, he goes on to ask what I would say are all the right questions, because ultimately he wants to know not only how many people who are from these castes are in the parliament, but also who's representing their interests. So the question of virtual representation comes right back once you've asked the question. Okay, great. So now we know who, or we know something about who, and now the question is how. So we're going to divide people up and we're going to cast votes, and we want to think about the consequences. Okay, so this guy you might recognize. This is the very important American jurist Felix Frankfurter, who was a real kind of stalwart on the court against thinking about all this. He said it was too hard. And so you might know this famous quote of his from Colgrove v. Green from maybe 1946, in which he says, "I don't want to talk about redistricting. I don't want to talk about it. It is a political thicket." Is that a familiar quote? Have you heard of this? The political thicket? Well, slightly less famously, he also called it a mathematical quagmire, right? So now it's both. It's like to be avoided on two counts. So in the 40s, he was on the winning side, and he succeeded in keeping the courts away from this. In the 60s, he failed. And this was, in fact, his very last case, and then he left the court after this. There's a really great episode of More Perfect, which is a podcast that thinks about the Supreme Court, that talks about this case and Frankfurter's role in it. Strongly recommend. Anyway, so what is he saying about why this is mathematically difficult, not just politically difficult? He's saying, whether or not it's inappropriate, we can discuss that separately, but he's saying the court today, because he's in the dissent, catapults the lower courts of the country into a position without giving them the basis for a legal calculus as a means of extraction. Okay, so what's he saying? He's saying, you're throwing us into a place where we're going to have to calculate the weight of a vote with no formula, right? There's just, you're taking us to a place where we're going to have to balance things that we can't measure. How can we balance what we can't measure? It's a good question, right? And he goes on to warn, I think, quite presciently, that this doesn't just, so at issue in 1962 was the question, should it be okay to have one district have much more population than another district, but they each elect one person? Should that be okay? And that was happening all over the country at the time. Some districts would have 9 or 10 times the population of others, each electing a single member to the Congress or the state legislature. And the court was stepping in to say that should not happen. They introduced the idea, one person, one vote, right? That we should have some sort of equality of voting power. And he was like, but we don't know how to measure that. He was like, you think we're just talking about balancing population, but look where that's going to take us. We're going to have to talk about geography, economics, urban-rural conflict, and all this undefined vista now opened up by review. And they were like, yeah, but it's important, so we're going to do it anyway. Okay, so I'm here to say Frankfurter was so right. He was so right. They were going to have to, and now all over the world, we have to think about these things. And so I'm going to devote the rest of the talk to sort of, Frankfurter's revenge. Okay, so being a math modeler who thinks about elections, I think about elections in terms of mechanisms. When you want certain kinds of outcomes, you build a system. The system is a mechanism to deliver you some outcomes that you want. And the whole study of social choice asks, if we have these ideas about fairness, what systems can deliver them, right? And it used to be that in social choice we asked, what systems can deliver on fairness all of the time? And we got an answer, none. No systems can do that. And so the modified question is, what can usually deliver on close to fairness most of the time, maybe, right? We sort of hedge the question and we try to see what we can do. Okay, so let's think about those mechanisms. So what are some electoral systems used in the world? Well, here in the US, we tend to love single member districts, by which I just mean a district that elects one person, single member district, and plurality voting, whoever gets the most votes wins. Okay, so in effect, we only ask you for your first choice. We don't ask you how much you like them. We don't ask you for your second choice and third choice and so on. We typically just ask you to pick one. Much of the rest of the world uses something called party list voting. Just out of curiosity, you folks know what that is? Okay, so in most of the rest of the world, you vote for a party when it comes to the legislature. That party creates a list. In one classical version, that list would be an ordered list of who they'd like to seat. And then depending on the share of the votes that they receive, that dictates how deep in the list they can go, seating people. And so it's a system that's proportional by design, right? You, up to rounding, you get just as much representation as you had voting support. Okay, so if we go back, and we think about what is good representation? We ask Hannah Pitkin again, what is good representation, right? Part of that had to do with being representative and reflective. And one version of that is proportionality, right? What share of support you get should dictate what share of the seats you get. Okay, so this is a mechanism for that if, and only if, we believe that parties will do a good job of sort of representing the range of possible views and constructing lists that embody them. That's a big if around the world. There are other systems. So maybe some folks know this one, mixed member proportional. As far as I know, this is only in place, 2 places in the world, Germany and New Zealand. And in New Zealand, it was cloned from Germany because they were like, that sounds pretty cool. And I'll tell you how this works just briefly. You have your legislature. You have a certain number of seats elected out of districts in the classical way. But you ask people to cast 2 votes. They vote for a person running for election in their district, and they vote for a party. And it doesn't have to be that the person belongs to the party. Then there are a leftover bucket of seats that are filled to try to restore proportionality according to the party vote as much as possible. So that's what's called mixed member. It's got aspects of this and aspects of that. Everybody with me? Yeah.
Sorry.
No, please.
Are the people on the party list also the individuals being voted in independently?
Good question. No, not in New Zealand. So I'm just back from New Zealand. I was down there for a few weeks talking to lots of people about elections. They're separate. And so you have, as a candidate, you have some interesting decisions to make about whether to run in a district or whether not to, right? And as I'll tell you in a moment, you have more decisions to make when it comes to New Zealand. Okay, so those are kind of broad kinds of systems, but very frequently they on their own wouldn't deliver satisfactory results, right? And so here's what I mean by that. You can sort of see that reflected in the kinds of exceptions that are in place around the world. I love this one. In the Slovenian National Assembly, there are 90 members. 88 are elected by party list, but the other 2 are elected by different people in a different way. Right, so the 2 minorities, the Hungarian and Italian-speaking language minorities, elect 2 seats by a different system called board account, and they possess a veto on policy related to the handling of relevant questions. Okay, so that's an exception. It's a carve-out, and the obvious idea here is that it's important for these language minorities to have representation, and they wouldn't get it by the regular mechanism, right? So this is a kind of correction. This is so interesting to me. The Hong Kong Legislative Council has 90 seats. 30 of them are reserved for what are called functional constituencies, which are interest groups. Isn't that interesting? So some of those are medical, education, engineering. There has been one, they come in and out. There has been one called rural, right? And so there are different kinds of interests which reflect a clear worry that the normal mechanisms of election wouldn't do a good job at getting these interests represented, right? And so for instance, the teaching constituency, you have to be a teacher or a school administrator to vote for these seats, right? Okay, and New Zealand, not content with mere mixed member proportionality, New Zealand has another correction layered on top of it for its important ethnic indigenous minority called Maori. So okay, so this is very interesting, I think. So in New Zealand, there are 65 districts that cover the whole country. Then ignore those. There's a different set of 7 districts that cover the whole country. So everybody lives in one of these 65 and one of those 7 at the same time. You guys see what I mean? Okay, these are called the general roll, and those are called the Maori roll. If you are Maori in the eyes of the government, hark back to the census, right? If you are Maori in the eyes of the government, you must choose whether to register this way or that way. Isn't that interesting? And anyone can run for the Maori seats. You don't have to be Maori. There's also a political party called the Maori Party, and you don't have to be in that either, right? It's a mechanism for making sure that Maori preferences are reflected in these very specific seats. So when I heard about this, I got very curious. How do Maori people decide how to register? Is this a very strategic decision that's made? And the answer is, over time, the percentage of eligible Maori who vote that way in the Maori roll has been dwindling. It's now sitting at about 52% of eligible voters. And I happened to be there during the census and get to talk to some people who think about policy around this, and asked the question, what makes someone decide which way to register? And at least anecdotally, but from a sociologist, the answer was typically people who don't register in the Maori roll don't feel as identified with the Maori community. And so there's a sort of self-identification question, a social identification question that she argues governs people's choices of how to register that's different from the technical eligibility question. Okay, so I thought this was really interesting. So here you have, in a way, you have 3 systems layered on top of each other. You have a districted system, a party proportional system, and an ethnic kind of set aside, right? All operating simultaneously. But, last week, these are just particularly kind of notable examples, but actually there are exceptions in place in most of the whole world. And more than half of the countries in the world maintain some kind of quota system. I was really startled to learn this. Famously, this is true for some Asian countries that have quotas for women in representation, but actually it's true all over the world. The most common mechanism for this is a voluntary quota by parties. So the parties agree informally in a kind of handshake deal that they'll have at least some percentage of women and other relevant minorities on their list, right? And again, the message here, the takeaway is we don't trust our primary systems to do the job that we want them to do in terms of descriptive representation anyway. And so there's this kind of complicated system of correctives in place to try to bring things more in line with our hopes. Okay, so let's talk about how all of this interacts with geography. And so this will be the last part of what I want to say today. Okay, so before I go into the sort of cartoon version of why geography matters, let's pause and think about why we might want one of those systems we just described over another. So for instance, why in America are we so in love with districts, with single member districts? Where does it come from? There are a lot of answers, but one of them is old, which is, Hamilton, Madison, Federalist Papers, it doesn't go much deeper than that in American political history, are writing about districts as a way to represent local interests. So you get, although they don't quite talk about it in these terms, you get notions of community. Hamilton calls it competing local jealousies. I love that phrase, right? So the idea that, maybe today we would say there are areas of Louisiana where the shrimping industry is really important. Decisions are going to be made that pertain to that industry. It would be nice to have someone from the area who understands the needs of shrimpers in the state legislature and maybe even in the national legislature, right? So the competing local jealousies is also supposed to mean that some of these small kind of micro interests might balance each other out and kind of have to contend against each other to make decisions in the sort of greater national good, right? So that's part of it. We'll see more reasons, but that's one of them. It's supposed to be that people who live near each other might have more in common, and we want that to be reflected. Okay, so here's a schematic that shows a population that's a little bit more than half gray and a little bit less than half orange. And I'm just pointing out the obvious thing, which is that you could divide that up into, in this case, equal area pieces in a whole bunch of ways, securing any representation from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 seats for the orange minority. Right? So that's 0 to 3 out of 4. At least when you do it this way on a kind of computer screen or a chalkboard, it looks like you have all the control of the outcomes. If you have knowledge of competing local jealousies and you have control of the lines, you control the outcomes. Okay, but how much that's true depends on how people are organized. So on that last slide, I had gray on one side and orange on the other. Here's a slightly more nuanced version of that, where in these 4 plots, I have the same number of club suit voters, 12 out of 36. So 1/3 of the population wants to vote for the club suit party. Okay? Now I'm going to divide these up into 6 districts and ask how much representation does the club suits voters get? Well, instead of showing you that it could be done to give them a little or it could be done to give them a lot, I'm going to show you all the ways. Okay? So there are exactly this many plans. There are 451,206 and no more ways to cut up a 6x6 grid into 6 almanos. Are we with me? Okay? And if I just throw them all into a giant histogram and I ask how much representation for this 1/3 minority, right? If we liked proportionality as our benchmark of fairness, we would want them to get 2 seats out of 6, right? But what tends to happen is sometimes proportional and sometimes subproportional and sometimes superproportional. So you can see if the folks were organized this way, if the club support was organized in this very scattered way, then they're not going to do very well. Because since they're fairly uniform, they're going to be about 1/3 of every district, and so they're not going to control any districts. Everybody see that? And so the expected representation will be about half a seat. By the way, notice since the seats have 6 voters, it's possible to get a half a seat, and so that's why there are half integers in the outcomes. Everybody okay with the plot here? Okay. So, boo, we're sad. If we're organized like these clubs voters in the blue world, we're going to get really kind of stubbornly subproportional representation. Now, you might think that if you're really clustered like this, that would be bad. In fact, conventional wisdom says this is one of the reasons Democrats do badly in today's American landscape. They're too clustered in the cities, and so they get packed into some districts, and they lose all the others, right? You've probably heard that. I think that's quite wrong, right? Because in terms of anything I can model, the best way to get good representation is to be quite clustered, actually. And so you can see here that in this cartoon example, being very clustered like this gives you just about proportional representation and expectation. Any questions? You see what I've done here?
So I don't understand. This is averaging over what?
This is tabulating, so this is a frequency histogram over this many possible districting plans.
What does that mean? What kind of plans? What is a districting plan?
A districting plan is a partition of this grid into 6 connected regions of 6 squares each.
Connected. So
Connected.
That's a definition.
Yes, very important.
So okay. So
And-
it's a
and-
definition of what is
Yeah,
acceptable.
well, sure.
It is not acceptable. Connected anyway is acceptable.
Well, and I have to specify what connected means. Do you force rook contiguity or do you allow queen contiguity? I've done this with rook contiguity.
Which
Yeah, and so when you change the definition, you change these histograms. And you can impose additional rules. For instance, suppose I say, okay, not only do I want 6 connected districts, but I also don't want them to be too long and skinny. I want them to have a short perimeter. The pictures will change. So this is one of the things that I do in the study of redistricting, is I think about how the rules change the universe of outcomes. It's hard. And that conventional wisdom doesn't get you very far. It's a really deeply empirical question that's different in every state that I've studied. Like, fun trivia question for you. What are the only 2 states in the US where when you do this kind of analysis of the real political geography, there isn't an advantage for Republicans over what you'd expect from the percentages alone. What two states do not have an advantage for Republicans? And the answer is, I mean, you're not going to guess it unless you're like me, a complete redistricting geek.
Does this depend on who is in power?
I'm talking about under today's pattern of where people live and how they vote. So if you take, for instance, the presidential elections from the last 2 or 3 cycles, and then you impose kind of random redistricting plans according to the rules of redistricting in the US today, where do you not see, so in almost every state, I claim, you see Republicans securing an advantage over what you'd expect from sort of vote share patterns alone.
Alaska and Hawaii.
Alaska, very good, and Virginia. And I know, it's interesting. And for different reasons, as far as I can tell. Why did you think of Alaska?
Because it's pretty homogenous.
Oh, okay, actually the thing that's going on in Alaska is it's the only state where the rural parts are more democratic than the cities. And that's because of Native Alaskan population in the rural parts of Alaska, whereas the city of Anchorage is actually fairly red, right? Virginia, any guesses what's special about Virginia in terms of its political geography? Well, name the big cities in Virginia. That's right, you're done. There aren't any, right? So yes, it's true, the whole northern Virginia region near DC is fairly blue, but it doesn't have these kind of the enclaving effect that you see in almost every state in the US. So there are these really subtle, and I'm telling this as though it's a clear answer to a clear question, but actually it's a deep and hard question that I don't think it's possible. It's very high dimensional, this whole question of where people live and how they vote. I don't think it's possible to summarize glibly, but just to say deeply empirical and something that like is the math question that keeps on giving, right?
No, but you said that there are redistricting rules.
Yes.
Can you just name a couple of those?
Absolutely. Can I put it off till the end? Because that's my happy place. But I want to tell you about a few other things first. We'll come back to that, I promise. Okay, everybody with me here? So, but I want to bring this back to the political philosophy question that's kind of at the heart of my interest here, which is, what's the representation we deserve, right? And there's something about today's American legal political logic that says the way the chips fall is fair. Blind equals fair, right? And I'll build out the sort of worldview around that momentarily. But if you believe that the mere rules of redistricting, whatever they are, lead to very different representational outcomes, do these become benchmarks of fairness? If you're willing to accept that entailment, then somehow these clubs' voters are less entitled to representation than those, right? Oh, there's one other fun fact I wanted to say for the mathy people in the room about this. So there are many, many ways to arrange 12 out of 36, right? 36 choose 12. Of all of them, the typical representation is going to be about 1 seat. So the typical representation is going to be pretty subproportional. When you're clustered, you actually do very well and get up close to proportionality. And this, I can tell you, because I searched them all, is the best of all. So if you got to pick where to live, this is the configuration that actually, this is the highest possible representational outcome. Yeah?
Do you know what that pattern becomes as like the numbers grow bigger?
No, I mean, that's the question, man. That's it. I really want to understand that. And I've spent years trying to understand it. Like what, and so you'll notice if you were kind of eyeing everything on here. So this is an excerpt from the introduction to a book that I've recently released, an edited volume. And I sort of puzzle over that question in this book introduction. So this is a measure of clustering that asks how many pairs of neighbors are the same versus different, and wonders, could that be explanatory for how good the representation is, and then says, nope, that doesn't capture it. So there's something subtle going on about the spatial arrangement that optimizes your representability. But I would submit to you, none of this is relevant to your sort of kind of deserved representation, right? And so these are quirks of the system of districts that it was very hard to measure until the kind of math caught up with the modeling problem. Okay, great. So let's kind of bring it home. So that's supposed to make you think of different kinds of people, right? And so, for instance, in Lowell, Massachusetts, just up the road from where I live, there was recently a court case suing the city council for not for having zero minority representation on the security council, on the city council. So they were sued by a coalition of Asian and Latino voters. And if you look at Lowell, this is the density of Asian voting age population. This is Latino voting age population. But some of the issues that were kind of on the table were, where should the school be located? The high school was being moved. Where should the new high school be? And affordable housing policy. But if you actually look at where renters live and where school-age children live, those are totally widely distributed. Why did I put this right after the last slide? This kind of distribution is going to ensure that districts are bad for you, right? This is exactly that scattered kind of geographical arrangement that all but ensures you cannot be well represented in the system of districts, as long as you're in the numerical minority. What happened in Lowell was really interesting. The lawsuit was successful. The city entered a consent decree. They agreed to change their system. Voters got to vote on how to vote. So this is even better than before, when voters got to vote on who to vote for them. Now voters got to vote on the system. And they were offered two choices: districts for the first time in the city's history, or something else called ranked choice voting, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a little bit. And I made these charts and went up to community meetings and talked to people and said, for those of you who sued the city, districts are not going to work very well, right, for these reasons, but ranked choice will. They voted, and instead of being asked multiple choice, do you prefer districts or ranked choice, they were asked, do you want districts, yes or no? Do you want ranked choice, yes or no? You can see there's a little problem with how the question was structured. But the voters voted 60% for districts and 48% for ranked choice, and so they got districts for the first time in city history. Okay.
Just at large, or what was the system before?
Yeah, it was plurality at large. Actually, I think I probably have a little, this was the system before. Everybody was able to cast multiple votes, and they were tallied up, and whoever got the most votes was elected. And here you can see meet your new cat overlords, right? That plurality at large as a system, when a group has majority control, it will sweep the representation. And so, in fact, what had been happening in Lowell wasn't only that the people on the city council were all white, which they were all from the same tiny neighborhood in the city. So districts fixed one problem, which was geographic representation, competing local jealousies, but didn't necessarily fix the other problem. We'll have to see after a few more elections how it pans out. Okay. All right, so let's sort of, looking at the time, bring things to a close. All right, so I have some fun Chicago facts to show you, but I really want to get to kind of where we are today in terms of the legal system and the changes that are coming and what we can all do as multidisciplinary scholars of fairness to think about what comes next. This is an actual picture from one of my expert reports in Texas redistricting. These really are the districts in the Houston area with the racial dot density overlaid. Yeah, I guarantee you the court is going to uphold these districts. Okay, so today the Voting Rights Act is on notice. So what is the Voting Rights Act? It's the very important law from 1965 that says if the reasons that a minority cannot get representation are structural, if the reasons are structural, then you have to change the system, right? And that's been operationalized in a very particular way. So what does it mean to show structural obstructions? It means to show that it would have been possible to draw districts where your group had a majority in some of the districts, and that patterns of preference by the majority and the minority are different enough that the minority's will is being blocked. Okay, so let me repeat that. You have to show, you have two groups. One is not getting representation. You have to show that's because they have consistently different preferences, and the majority is always overruling the minority, but it would have been possible to draw it some other way. See that? So there's an existence proof embedded in today's framework. Here's how that's turned out. The court case that the Voting Rights Act comes in over here. So here's American history since Reconstruction. Civil War ends in 1865. And if you look at the number of black representatives, just for example, in the US Congress, you see a blip coming from the South after Reconstruction. And then you see the sort of Jim Crow period comes in and like wipes out black representation in the whole country for a period. There's a great migration where black folks move from the South to industrial cities like this one. And you start to see some representation from the North. The Voting Rights Act comes in here in 1965, and there's an uptick. But it's not till this other thing happens that there's this enormous turn going on. What is this other thing? It's those rules I just told you. It's that existence proof and the patterns proof. It's like a mathematical, it's quantitative anyway, framework of checkboxes that tells you when you can sue. Okay? And so in those other countries, we looked at corrective mechanisms for making sure you have minority representation. Here it's lawsuits, right? And it's lawsuits that got specific at this one period and that really had an enormous consequence in terms of representation. Everybody with me? Okay, so this is the VRA. It's been around since 1965, and it's like absolutely on notice from today's court. So for today's court, any use of race-conscious policy is suspect. So there's been a kind of status quo for decades where if you can show that you're using race in a limited way to obtain a good government goal, then it's okay if it survives strict scrutiny. And that's what's being narrowed and narrowed and narrowed today. Okay, so I just want to tell you how that's playing out in Alabama, and I'll stop with this. So behold, Alabama. This is a geologic map of Alabama, and that is a race map of Alabama with all of the precincts shaded by their percentage of black population. Okay, so if you look at that, you'll notice a striking visual correspondence between this region, which is called the Black Belt of Alabama, and this region here, which has a particular kind of very fertile soil and therefore had a lot of plantation slavery, followed by sharecropping, followed by persistent kind of rural, economically depressed, and more significantly black population than the rest of the state. So that's called the Black Belt. And what else can you see? You can also see the cities, right? So here's Mobile, and there's Huntsville, and you can see Birmingham and Montgomery. So cities and this rural swath are where black population largely lives in Alabama today. Questions, is that clear? Okay, and that's the state's districting plan. Okay, so this does what's called packing and cracking. It's got one district here represented by Terry Sewell that is heavily black, about 60%. And then all the others don't get over, 20, 30%. And in particular, you see lines kind of slicing right through areas of more black population. So this is the state's districting plan that was challenged by a number of plaintiffs. And so again, under today's legal framework, what do you have to do to challenge that plan? You have to show polarization of voting. Alabama is the most polarized state in the country by some measures, so nobody disputes that. And then you have to show that it could have been otherwise. There's typically an expert who comes in and draws the maps that demonstrate that you could have done it differently. In this case, that expert was me. And so these are the 4 demonstration maps from the case that was called Merrill v. Milligan. It's changed names a few times since then. So what do you see about my maps? It's that you see this district here that didn't exist in the others. There's a district that captures that black belt of population. And so rather than having the one majority black district, now there are 2 in each of these maps. Okay. Any questions? By the way, it's important to say it's this Supreme Court that has demanded that demonstrative maps have an extra 50% black district. You might think all that you'd need is to show a district that would support a black preferred candidate. But in 2009, in Bartlett v. Strickland, John Roberts authored the decision that said, no, we meant 50%. Okay, so they made a very race-conscious rule for how to sue. And then what happened in court is today's court said, oh, but you had to think about race too much to draw your maps, for which we made a minimum racial threshold. So Alabama, the district court found for plaintiffs, found for us, and then the state appealed it up to the US Supreme Court. They asked the court to stay the decision the Supreme Court to stay the decision by the district court that said the map was discriminatory and had to be replaced, and the Supreme Court did so. Alabama said, get rid of the VRA entirely. If you're not willing to do that, let's impose a new interpretation. And here's the new interpretation. So here I'm showing you a like Markov chain of districting plans, a sequence of random districting plans being made just according to those rules of redistricting. Alabama said minorities should only be entitled to as much representation as they would get by a blindly drawn map. Everybody see what's going on here? Okay. And as we saw, you have to be extremely clustered to get anything like proportional representation out of a blindly drawn map. And if you thought Alabama is very segregated, the answer is it's not nearly segregated enough. So I can tell you that out of 2 million blindly drawn maps by some process we can talk about later if you want, the process never encountered one with 2 majority black districts, never. And in fact, the expected number of majority black districts was not 1, but 0.00008 was the expected number of majority black districts. And to today's court, that's prima facie evidence that there is no protection for black preferred representation in Alabama. Okay, so in other words, only the most highly segregated groups in the country would have a chance of proportional representation. So last term, the court surprised some by taking on Roe v. Wade. And then I read a whole lot of pieces coming out in the press about what's next. I don't hear anyone talking about this, but this was heard by the court on October 4th of this year, and we are currently waiting on the decision. And that decision could end the Voting Rights Act, or it could impose this new kind of repurposing of all the math tools that have been built by me and others over the last few years in an attempt to kind of descriptively understand how bad districts can be for minority representation. That description is potentially about to be elevated as the new benchmark of fairness. Everybody get the sort of move? Okay, so that's where we are.
Were you there at October 4th?
No, I was testifying in South Carolina that day. Experts don't testify for the Supreme Court. Experts only testify at district courts, and then it's just the lawyers fight it out at the Supreme Court. And in fact, this entire case that might end the Voting Rights Act was calendared for 1 hour of debate at the court on October 4th. Okay, so what happens next? There's a lot we can do. We can come up with more complex models of identity to understand voting. Here I'm just gonna sort of plug some projects, and I'd love to talk to y'all. I'll be here in Chicago for a few more weeks, and anyone who's kind of intrigued by any of this, it's all really active work, and I'd love to talk. So you can come up with more complex models of identity to understand how demographic difference predicts vote difference. You can bring back spatiality. There isn't enough geography in the law when it comes to how we think about voting. So these are some Chicago models. By the way, did you know Lori Lightfoot, when elected in 2019, was slightly more popular with white than non-white voters in the city of Chicago? Did you know? There's a lot you can learn when you do kind of a sort of detailed analysis of how people vote. Jerry Joyce, do you guys remember him? The number 2 white candidate in that first round Democratic primary had a really interesting pattern of support. Among the whitest precincts in Chicago, there were kind of 3 distinct neighborhoods that loved him, hated him, and shrugged at him, right? And if you ignore spatiality and you only think that like race predicts your vote, you really wouldn't understand what's going on. I can tell you these are 3 distinct neighborhoods, and you can probably guess which ones they are. I'm working on some topological data analysis models that try to say, what if we didn't decide in advance that race is the most predictive, but we asked? What is it about the social and economic and geographic variables? This is Chicago, by the way, that best predicts the vote. This is Rahm Emanuel versus Chuy Garcia. And these are clusters of precincts that are demographically similar and have similar vote preferences. It does not turn out to be a straight line, right? It has some topology. And there's an interesting story here. Please, again, this is the part where I just try to get you curious. And finally, we can think about new electoral systems. We don't have to just use those. We can use things like ranked choice voting, which let votes transfer from preferred candidates to next preferred candidates. and kind of give you emergent proportionality. So if we want to think about mechanism design and we want to think about proportional outcomes, we should stop putting Band-Aids on bad systems and look for better systems. And so here's an example of, this is Chicago's aldermanic districts, and this is sort of a mock-up of what they might look like if you move to a multi-member ranked choice system. Okay, so in the end, this sort of brings back Lonnie Guinier. Let's keep talking about norms and systems. I kind of want to be the data science team she never had, right? Because, you know, roles matter. Okay, thank you.
Awesome. So we're happy to take questions. Just raise your hand if you have a question.
Yes, and thank you for hanging with all of that wild ride. Can I go back to the what are the rules question? Okay, so what are the rules? So there are only 2 rules that are in federal law. And those are 1 person, 1 vote, so the districts have to have equal population according to the census, and the Voting Rights Act, while we still have it. Those are the only 2 federal rules. However, the states all have guidelines, and there are 4 more things that almost always appear in state guidelines. Connected districts, respect for political boundaries, which means that you should try to keep counties whole unless you have to split them. You should try to keep cities whole unless you have to split them. And then finally, the vaguest of all, and maybe one of the most interesting, is respect for community. What does that mean? Yeah. More than 30 out of 50 states have that written in their rules, that the lines should respect communities. So actually that map I showed you of Chicago here, you guys probably know that here at the U of C, if you know your U of C history, in the 1920s, the sociology department came up with community areas, right? 77 of them, I think. Yeah. Yep. This is a districting plan that doesn't cut any of them. Right? And so like one version of what would it mean to respect communities is to identify them, preferably not by some elites at the University of Chicago, preferably by asking people, where's your community? Identify communities and try to keep them whole inside districts, or where they're really large, keep districts whole inside them. That's one way forward. And actually, I was telling you, Justin, that I was just in New Orleans for a conference, and that's what the conference was about. The Supreme Court's most likely about to take away the Voting Rights Act. If it doesn't happen this year, its days are numbered. Can we find ways to take that vague idea that community is important and turn it into something that gives us fairer outcomes? So that's something that a lot of groups are thinking about. So those are the big 6 rules. And then there are a lot of little micro rules in different places. But that gives you a sense. They're vague, they're not ordered, they're not quantitative for the most part. And so turning that into a framework for sampling is actually quite a challenge. But that's the legal challenge we face today. Questions or comments? Yeah.
I felt like this talk made a lot of sense and like talked to all of us from different perspectives. So is the hardest part when trying to convince people something like, oh, this is too technical, or do they all kind of get that, you know, the technical parts, you distill that right, and it's more just like ideological? They're like, yeah, well, we're not going to do that. You need more political capital to get that done. Thing.
Well, there are a few hard parts. I mean, one hard part is a giant disconnect between people's intuitions and the law. And so, you know, if I had asked you all first, which I really should have done if I had all the time in the world, what you thought fairness could be measured by, what's a benchmark for fairness, chances are you would have mentioned proportionality, right? If we're thinking anyway about party representation for one thing, or we're thinking about racial representation, something like proportionality might seem fair. Well, you cannot say proportionality in an American court of law. You can't. You'll get just an enormous amount of pushback that goes something like, well, if you want a proportional system, move to Europe. You know, it's really kind of, our system is not proportional. You can't demand proportionality, no requirement for proportionality. It's a non-starter. And so that means you need to introduce norms in courts that kind of get at some of that underlying intuition without doing quite that. So here's a plot. Let's see if I can find it. I wanted to show you what that looks like in North Carolina. Here. So this is from my expert report. So I've worked in 7 states in this redistricting cycle. I'm on leave from my professor gig this year to go be a official expert, which is pretty remarkable thing for a pure theorist like me to sort of get born again to do. So I've been qualified by courts now, not only as an applied mathematician and a statistician. I'm like, oh, really? But also as a cartographer and a demographer. They just give me all this expertise for free. It's fantastic, right? But anyway, so these are from some expert reports in North Carolina, and what they show is votes in North Carolina in 30 elections in the last 10 years versus the number of seats they would have had, where red is the state's proposed plan, and green is like a good government plan proposed by an outside group. You guys with me? Okay, so these plots are showing you how votes get converted to seats. Now, proportionality is one of these diagonal lines, right? And some people, there are other formulas out there that people like as metrics of fairness. There's something called the efficiency gap you might have heard of. It's a line of a different slope, whatever. You can disagree about what the winner's bonus should be. But I think if you're in a democracy, one thing you probably want to agree on is that more of the votes should tend to give you more of the representation. So you want to be in one of these quadrants, and you don't want to be in these quadrants. You guys right with me on that, right? And the other thing I think we want to agree on is that when the votes are close to half and half, the seats should be close to half and half. So today, North Carolina has 14 seats. Okay. So in order to introduce that in court and not be accused of smuggling in proportionality, I made up a name for it. I called it the close votes, close seats principle. I'm not even kidding. You can't make this up, right? And the court actually, in its decision, the Supreme Court of North Carolina enshrined that as a rule now in North Carolina. I was like, yes, a win for principle. And so if you followed gerrymandering this cycle, you'll know that the Supreme Court of North Carolina threw out this plan. They didn't put this plan in place, but they brought in someone to draw one, which looked a lot more like this. Did everybody see what I'm doing with these pictures? Okay, and then you might have heard an election happened in 2022. The North Carolina Supreme Court went from 4-3 Democratic to 5-2 Republican, and they went back to this plan. So there's something really wrong with our courts today. There's something really kind of intractable. And that corrective mechanism, which used to happen through the courts, is not going to be available for the foreseeable future. It will be in some of the country and not the rest. It won't be when it goes up to the Supreme Court. And so I think the role for people like me, and hopefully some of you, is to sort of do the hard work, to build up the theory, build up the modeling tools, and lay the groundwork for the next time there's an opening for democratic reform.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Why is proportionality a non-starter?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't actually blame Hamilton, although one could. But I think there's a few reasons for that. I mean, why don't we kind of national rail service in this country? Because you get the same line, right? Go to Europe, So there's a certain kind of tradition in American jurisprudence that tends to say, so I went over one reason we like districts, and that was competing local jealousies. But actually there's another. The Voting Rights Act itself brought back the primacy of single-member districts. I actually want to point that out because I think it's an important piece of the story, and it sort of comes to your question. So what was wrong with the districts in Lowell, Mass. that I was talking about? They were plurality at large, and that's a system where even tiny but block voting majorities get total control, right? So that system was being used in the early 60s. Mississippi tried to move to that system after the 1960 census for the first time for some reason, right? And so the Voting Rights Act comes along in 1965, right on the heels of these decisions that say our political systems are judiciable. We can think about them, justiciable, judiciable. And what it says is, when there's a system that structurally disenfranchises, we replace it. But the test refers to districts. And that's because what was on people's mind was the African American franchise. And if you remember from the Tuskegee example, across the whole South, and frankly, we also saw it in Boston and we also saw it in Chicago, the patterns of black residential arrangement were so highly segregated that districts could be an effective mechanism. But the Voting Rights Act evolved over time to first be used for other racial and ethnic minority groups, then language minorities. It kind of expanded over time. And then we saw, as in Lowell, that like Latino and Asian groups, and here in Chicago, just aren't segregated in the same kinds of patterns. So the second reason that districts have felt really fundamental to American political identity is that they were thought to be good for civil rights. It's actually quite interesting. They were thought to be strong mechanisms for converting a global minority into a local majority. So that's how you get minority representation in a majoritarian paradigm, right? But it only works when you're sufficiently segregated and where the lines are not being drawn adversarially, right? So I think there are lots of historical reasons why proportionality is a non-starter, but one of them is trust in districts. And I would say that it's just really the math of the last 5 or 10 years that has started to reveal the depth of the pathologies of districts, right? And so if we had a more receptive court, I think there's been a breakthrough. I mean, this court has even stipulated to the relevance of these kinds of randomized districting methods for understanding how districts tend to behave. And now the question is just, what does that have to do with fairness, right? So that's a long-winded answer, but I think it gets to some of the pieces of your question. Okay, I think we're probably out of time, but I'm going to stick around, so come on up. I'd love to talk to you. And I put my contact information on the last slide.
And we have a reception with some food behind us, so please join us.
We have
some food, so thank you.
all the good things.